I'm going to throw a date at you. June 17th, 1994. Do you remember where you were and what you were doing on June 17th, 1994? Not y'all. Not y'all. You were single cell organisms. June 17th, 1994. Here's a hint. Here's a hint for that. On that day, major television networks all across the country interrupted their regularly scheduled program to bring us live footage of a slow, low-speed car chase involving a certain white Ford Bronco in which was sitting none other than legendary NFL player O.J. Simpson. Now do you remember where you were? I bet a bunch of you do. And it's funny how our minds do that, right? It's funny how those kinds of things will stick with us. And, those kinds of events, we remember where we were. O.J. Simpson went on to be tried for murder, if you recall, in the death of his wife and another man. And do you remember the media frenzy surrounding that whole trial? Do you remember that? I mean, it wasn't for nothing. It came to be called the trial of the century. That was the nickname that was placed on it because of all the publicity that it garnered, and also because of how important it seemed at the time. I mean, was there anything at the time that seemed more important than that trial? There really, it didn't seem that way to watch the news and to watch the media and things like that. But here's the thing: trial of the century, as great of a label as that is, doesn't even begin to hold a candle to a trial that took place in about AD 33, a trial in which Jesus of Nazareth went in front of Pilate, Pontius Pilate, Roman governor, for judgment and sentencing. A trial that I think can rightfully be called the trial of the ages. If OJ was trial of the century, Jesus is trial of the ages. This is a trial that, unlike OJ, had implications that have reached down through the millennia and are still having effects right now on eternity, like eternal implications. This is a trial this is a trial that actually matters and is actually going to transcend all of time. Also, as you know, O.J. Simpson was eventually acquitted. They got him on some other stuff later, but he was eventually acquitted. Jesus wasn't. Jesus wasn't. And just out of curiosity, does anybody in here have any law experience or anything like that? Any time in law school? Maybe you just were a clerk in a law firm for a minute. Okay, absolutely nothing. All right, great. Then this will be so much easier for me because I can just say stuff and you'll just be like, oh, I guess he's right. Okay, great. So I'm going to try something gutsy today. I'm going to try something I have never tried before. I'm going to try today to utilize my own non-existent law degree, emphasis on non-existent, and see if we can't go back in time and rewrite history. I'm going to see if we can't rewrite history today. I'm going to see if we can get Jesus acquitted. I'm going to see if we can get Jesus. Now, I know that has implications for us, but he didn't deserve all that. I'm going to see if we can get him acquitted. I'm going to watch this trial with you, like we all watched OJ. I'm going to watch this trial with you, and if I see something improper, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to lob my objection at that judge. And I'm going to see if we can't right some wrongs and correct some injustices and get some things happening. I'm going to see if we can't change the course of history today. Old move, I know, but I'm in a t-shirt. So this sermon is titled Trial of the Ages. And if you haven't done so already, please join me flipping over to the Gospel of John, chapter 18, picking up where we left off at verse 28. We'll take this in stages, or at least till I have an objection. So we're going to start at verse 28. You ready? Let's jump in. It says, Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Well, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. All right, stop. Objection, Your Honor. Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence. Assumes facts not in evidence. Now, great. I'm so glad none of you have law degrees. But does anybody watch Law and Order? Have you ever watched any of those shows? Anything like that? I feel like this is an objection we're probably not super familiar with, but this is an actual objection that a lawyer would make in a case. If there's a question being asked, if there's something being said to a witness where the questioner is assuming something to be true that hasn't actually been proven yet. It's when something you're trying to establish, you're assuming it's already true, and it could either be the questioner or just something that the witness is saying. But the lawyer will jump in and say, "Objection, assumes facts not in evidence," meaning this hasn't been proven yet. What are you talking about? Stop. Such as assuming somebody is guilty just because they're on trial. Our society today could probably hit the brakes on that one a little bit, but assuming someone is guilty just because they're on trial or just because an accusation has been lobbed at them, and then using that assumption as a basis for punishing that person when the guilt hasn't even been established yet. And if you look at the text, that's more or less what's happening here. Please note that the Jews don't actually present a formal charge when they just drag this man, Jesus, in front of Pilate. And Pilate's like, wait, what's the charge? Why are y'all bringing him to me? And they're all just like, all they have is like, trust me, bro. Like that's the charge. That's it. Just if he wasn't guilty, would we have brought him to you? Like no actual charges. And look, we've already seen, we've been walking through this. We've already seen how basically from the beginning, this entire trial has just been a sham to begin with. They haven't observed any of the legalities or technicalities or anything like that. From the moment Jesus was dragged in front of the high priest, we already knew this was a sham. And like I said, I'm no lawyer either. I haven't been to law school either. I haven't spent a minute in a law firm. But if I'm cross-examining these so-called witnesses, I'm focusing on two things here. I'm focusing on their conflict of interest as jealous religious leaders who see their position threatened. I'm focusing on that, but I'm also focusing on this unreliable testimony that's coming up, and the fact that they're not actually presenting formal charges. They're not actually presenting witnesses. They're not actually presenting evidence. They're just showing up like, take care of this problem for us. For example, you want to talk about unreliable witnesses? You want to talk about unreliable testimony? For example, they have no problem conspiring to kill a man without a fair trial. No problem whatsoever. They have no problem racking up false charges against this man. They have no problem basically kidnapping this man in the middle of the night so that the crowds won't see what they're doing. They have no problem demanding a death penalty for somebody who hasn't even been found guilty of a charge yet. They have no problem with any of that. But they couldn't enter the governor's house in verse 28 because they were afraid they might defile themselves. Talk about hypocrites. Talk about a bunch of hypocrites. You see, here's the thing. Under Jewish ceremonial law, they could not enter the home of a Gentile, which is what the Romans were. They were Gentiles, without fear of becoming ceremonially unclean. And if that happened, they couldn't participate in the Passover meal. So they're all worried about defiling themselves ceremonially, but conspiring to kill a man who's innocent, well, we got no problem with that. We're okay with that. But this is what hypocrisy does. And this is what legalism does. When we get a little too rulesy and we get a little too worried about ceremonial stuff and how we look on the outside to other people, which incidentally are the two main charges that Jesus always brings up against these guys whenever he gets into fights with them. This is his two main problems with them. If you're familiar with the argument that Jesus had with the religious leaders in Matthew 23:23, that's the line where Jesus said, and you'll remember this, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." He said, "For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." He says, "These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." Now, go home later. Go look in your pantry. Go find the dill, if you got some dill seasoning. Go find the cumin, if you have cumin. Go find the mint. Go find these things and go get that. We got some dill seasoning. Go sprinkle some of that out on the table. And then imagine being so legalistic that you would take these little dill kernels and you would count them so that you can take a tenth of them and go tithe them at the temple. Imagine being so legalistic that you would tithe your dill while at the same time you completely ignore things like justice and mercy and righteousness. Things that are far more important to God than your herb garden is. Like, I'll kill a man, I don't care, but if I have 100 dill kernels, I'm going to go give 10 of them at the temple because God will like me if I do that. Like, this is what legalism does. This is what hypocrisy does. And make no mistake, this kind of thing still goes on today. It just looks different from the outside. It just looks different from the outside. I used to live, I wasn't like the worst of the worst, but I used to live a pretty pagan lifestyle way back in the day. I mean, I did. I was what you would call a practical atheist. I would have told you I believe in God. I would have told you I believe in Jesus, but you would have had no idea I did if you just watched how I lived my life and you just watched the kinds of things I was doing. You would have had no idea. It would have been just words. Yeah, I believe. But you would have had no idea. My life did not match that at all. But hey, Lent rolls around, and all of a sudden it's Friday night, and I'm at McDonald's, and I'm ordering a fillet of fish instead of a quarter pounder with cheese, and God owes me now. I'm right with God now because I got a fillet of fish. It's squabbling over these tiny little rules and laws, some of which are man-made, but ignoring the things that are really important to God. That's what they're doing here. That's the problem. And the message there is that we all just need to stop and reflect on why we're doing the things we're doing. Are we doing it out of some obscure sense that following specific rules makes us more virtuous? Or are we doing it out of a genuine desire to please Jesus because we love him? Because if that's your motivation, then you're gold. You're good. But if you're just doing it because you think, hey, this is going to make me look good to the outside, to other people, or this particular rule is going to make me seem more virtuous to people, then you're now entering into legalism territory. And this is the major issue Jesus always had with these people. So I say it again. Objection, Your Honor. Assumes facts not in evidence. What does the judge say? What does my judge say? Oh, wow. Well, geez. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to verses 33 through 40 and see if we can try again. Okay? All right, let's pick up in verse 33. It says, "So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered, 'Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?' Pilate answered, 'Am I a Jew?' He said, 'Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?' Jesus answered, 'My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world.' Then Pilate said to him, 'So you are a king?' Jesus answered, 'You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice.' Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?' After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, 'I find no guilt in him.'" This is the guy in charge of his fate, supposedly, coming out saying, I find no guilt. I find no guilt in this man. But you, verse 39, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? They cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Now, incidentally, Barabbas was a lot more than a robber, but that's what John chose to focus on here. Objection, Your Honor. Leading the witness. Leading the witness. Now, okay, we know this one a little better, right? We know this one from Law and Order. Leading the witness. We're probably a little more familiar with this if you've ever seen a courtroom show. Leading the witness is when the person doing the questioning will ask the witness a question in such a way as to try to suggest or to compel or to even trick them into saying the thing they want them to say. That's called leading the witness. Leading the witness. Verse 37, Pilate says, Pilate does this. He says, so you are a king. He's saying this to Jesus. And Jesus calls him on it. He says, you say that I am a king. Notice Jesus never said that. He said, you say that I am a king. Notice Jesus never actually claims that mantle for himself. He says other things, but he never actually claims that mantle for himself, at least not in an earthly sense. What he does say is that he does have a kingdom, but he makes sure to specify some things about that kingdom, doesn't he? He qualifies that. So the thing to understand about Rome here, the thing to understand about Rome is in the first century, they, as they were conquering people, Rome was primarily concerned with keeping the peace. And so if they came in and they conquered your little country and they took you over, they would be more or less content to leave you be and to leave your practices and your culture and all that intact. They did not feel the need to just bulldoze it all and make you be like them. They would kind of leave you intact, provided you did some things, provided you acknowledged Rome, provided you paid your taxes and you supported them and you sent the people when they asked for troops and stuff like that, and provided you didn't make trouble. You did all those things, you were pretty much good to go. They would kind of leave you alone. But what they did not take kindly to was insurrection and riots. And they certainly would not have taken kindly to a guy running around saying he was the new king of the world. All right, they would have hated that. So like Leonardo DiCaprio in Titanic, like he gets up on the front of that boat and he's like, I'm the king of the world. Like they would have hated, like he would have died so much sooner in that movie if Rome was in charge. He's up on the front of the boat, I'm the king of the world, off with his head. And the movie's over. And that's such a better movie in my opinion. I'm watching, it's like Titanic meets 300 and I'm loving it. But they that's something they would not have wanted at all. Like you start talking about you're a king and you have this alternate kingdom and you're setting up your kingdom. That's where they're going to come in and say, okay, now we have a problem. But notice what Jesus does. He truthfully answers the question, and he does this twice in verse 36. He does it once again in verse 37, affirming that, yes, he has a kingdom, but his kingdom is in a different world. His kingdom is of a different world. In other words, Jesus is no political threat to Rome. He is not trying to overthrow Rome, which is all Pilate really cares about. He doesn't want some dude trying to stir up trouble, and he doesn't want some dude creating civil unrest, and he certainly doesn't want the Jews rioting. All of those things would make him look very, very bad as the governor. It's all he cares about. So he finds no fault with Jesus. In fact, you'll notice as we walk through this, 3 different times he says, I find no fault in this man. 3 times he says that. Pilate actually wants to release Jesus. We see Pilate trying to release Jesus. But as we're going to see at the end of the day, Pilate is still just a politician. And his sense of justice is going to take a backseat to these other things, like avoiding riots and avoiding civil unrest and all these things. So at the end of the day, he's going to be willing to do some very horrible things to a man that he considers innocent. So, we could object on the grounds of leading the witness. Technically, there's a second objection we can make, and that's the objection of hearsay. Hearsay. Typically a witness is only supposed to testify about things that they themselves have personally seen or heard or experienced, because that's the point. You're trying to get information. But sometimes the attorney, the questioner, or even the witness will volunteer this information. They'll start talking about things that they heard that someone else experienced, but they don't actually have firsthand experience of it. So that's called hearsay. And typically in American law, in American courtrooms, that kind of stuff's not allowed. They'll strike that from the record. Like, no, objection, Your Honor, hearsay. So we kind of see this in verses 33 and 34. Pilate asks Jesus if he's a king. And Jesus says, do you say this of your own accord? Or did others say it to you about me? Pilate has never heard him actually make this claim. He's going off of hearsay. It's hearsay. There's no one actually there testifying. There's no actual witnesses. So we got two grounds here for objections. And I mentioned this last week, and since I'm a Christian apologetics guy, there's something neat in these verses that I also want to point out to you that's kind of an aside. It's kind of an aside. When detectives will look at eyewitness testimony and they're trying to determine if that testimony is true or not, like police detectives today, one of the things they look for is corroborating. They look for details across multiple accounts called corroborating details that corroborate each other. Meaning, like, you might interview 5, 10 people, and you might get a detail in story A that helps explain something in story B that otherwise wouldn't make sense. And you look for these little corroborating details that fill in little gaps and fill in little things like this. Well, this is one of the ways we know when people are telling the truth, because we find these kinds of corroborating details. And we see these all over the place in the Gospels. And we actually get one right here in verse 36. Jesus says, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. Now, see, he parks on this idea of his servants fighting. He says, my servants would be fighting for me if my kingdom were of this world. Now, you would think that this would be a good time for Pilate to present that man from back in verse 10. You glance back. That poor guy back in verse 10. You remember him, Malchus, the guy that had his ear lopped off by Peter? It's like, wait a minute, your servants are fighting. What are you talking about? Remember him? Remember that guy? Told you last week, put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it, remember? Well, here we are. I keep those promises. So this would have been a great time for him to bring him out. And for that matter, when the Jews delivered Jesus over to Pilate, why didn't the Jews present this guy as evidence? Like, look, this guy's trying to start a revolution here. They're attacking the religious leaders. Look, he cut off this dude's ear. You would think the Jews would be parading this guy around. And so it doesn't really make sense for Jesus to say, well, my servants would be fighting. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants, they'd be fighting, when just like 10 minutes ago, his number 2 guy just cut off this guy's ear and left it in the ground. You would think, if all you had to go off of was the Gospel of John, this would be unexplainable. Where's Malchus? Where's the guy with one ear? Why aren't they talking about him right now? But when you look at Luke chapter 22, verses 47 through 53, this is what we see. It says, this is in the garden, it says, while he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. We just read this a couple weeks ago. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them, and notice he doesn't say who, he just says one of them, which is funny because Luke and Peter are buddies. So Luke just conveniently, I'm not trying to throw like any kind of doubt on Luke and his reliability, but it's just funny. He just says one of them. One of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. Okay, so far so good. We've seen this before. But watch. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs? He says, when I was with you every day at the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. So did you catch it? Did you notice that tiny little corroborating detail in Luke's account that we didn't see in John that helps explain why nobody in John is parading out a one-eared dude as evidence against Jesus? Because he doesn't exist. There is no one-eared dude. Okay, Jesus healed this guy and we see this in the Gospel of Luke. For whatever reason, John doesn't mention it, but it's a corroborating detail in another one of the, remember, the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. They're eyewitness accounts of the people who were there. Like John, the gospel writer, John, the disciple, is writing these words, and he's telling us what he saw firsthand standing in that garden next to Jesus. Luke is one of Peter's boys. He's also a physician. He's a medical doctor of his day. Luke is working closely with Peter, and we believe Peter is giving him a lot of his information. And you see a lot of Peter in the Gospel of Luke and stuff that you would see Peter say or do. And there's just, again, and you get these little details like him not saying the name. I don't know if that's on purpose or not. But we get these interesting little details because these are eyewitness accounts by the people who were there. John is writing John. Luke is writing Luke. And they are telling you exactly what they saw and what they witnessed and what they experienced. They can't parade a one-eared man in front of Pilate because everybody in the court has two ears. There is no one-eared guy. And like I said, there's actually a whole bunch of these all throughout the Gospels. You see these all over the place. And, one day we'll talk more, as we go here and there, we'll see more of them. I'll point them out to you. But we see these all over the place in the Gospels. But this is further evidence that they're telling the truth. And this is further evidence that we can trust what these guys are saying. And it's these tiny little details. So I've lobbed two objections, all right? Leading the witness and hearsay. Surely one of these is going to land. Judge, what do you say? Man, all right, I thought I had him there. All right, let's read on and try again. Let's move into John chapter 19, picking up in verse 1. It says, Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. I know I'm reading this kind of fast. Please try to soak in the horror of what's happening. Let me go back. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, he's talking to the Jews now, I am bringing him out to you that you may know I find no guilt in him. This man that we just beat within an inch of his life, but I find no guilt in him. Verse 5, So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves to crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to release you? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Objection, Your Honor. Badgering the witness. Badgering the witness. Come on, man. Badgering the witness. So, what is badgering the witness? If you're watching a court case and they say badgering the witness, this objection would mean that the line of questioning has gotten too hostile. It has gotten too aggressive. The interviewer, the questioner, is now bullying the witness or getting just too aggressive with the witness, something like that. And one thing I will say, with no uncertainty whatsoever, I'd say in verses 1 through 11, I think it's safe to say they're crossing a line now. They have just crossed a line. Now they're officially bullying Jesus, and now they've officially gotten pretty aggressive with Jesus. Am I right? So now we're badgering the witness. The crazy thing is, and we talked about this Wednesday night at the Easter study as well, is that Pilate believes Jesus is innocent. He believes Jesus is innocent. He has no problem with Jesus. He's doing all of this to Jesus under the false assumption that it'll satisfy the Jews and they'll back off. Like, maybe if I just beat this guy 98% of the way to death, they'll back off. What? Seriously? Like, you mean to tell me all of this is completely unnecessary? All of this is completely unnecessary? For the flogging in verse 1 didn't have to happen? What? 7 words. Verse 1 is 7 tiny little words. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. 7 little words that we can read in a second, but don't even do a shred of justice to the agony that went on between those 7 words. We watched a video 2 Wednesdays ago at the Easter study, and we watched a simulated flogging. And there were people in the room covering their eyes while we watched a simulated flogging. We're talking leather cords here, infused with shreds of bone and maybe even little shreds of like cement or concrete or other little hard materials, rocks, so that when they lashed you, those chips of bone and pieces of rock would dig into your skin like a claw. And then when they yank that whip back, guess what comes with it? The skin. Ripping skin away. And how many times would they hit him? You know, the Jews had this, 39 lashes thing. The Romans did not care about 39 lashes. They were just really good at figuring out, when's this guy going to die? And we'll stop like 1 lash short of killing him. And so, can he take 2 more? Okay, hit him with another one. Can he take 2 more? Okay, hit him with another one. And just doing that for as long as it took. A lot of times, people regularly died during the flogging before they could even bring them to crucify them. A lot of people, by the time they were done flogging you, you have vertebrae sticking out of your back because the skin is gone. This is the state of somebody who's been flogged by the Romans. But in verse 1 of chapter 19, it's just 7 innocuous little words. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Then they shove a crown of thorns on his head in verse 2. Here comes this crown of thorns. Scholars believe these thorns, these would have been the thorns of a particular plant called the date palm, which is actually a type of plant that is very plentiful all around Israel. And you can look at that picture behind me. And, please notice the thorns sticking out of the sides of it. This is just a random date palm plant somewhere, possibly in Israel. I'm not actually 100% sure, but that is a date palm plant. That's another one from another angle. Just look at those thorns, man. Look at them. Whatever you may have pictured in your mind before you saw these images, we're not talking like those little thorns on a rose bush. Those are bad enough, when you prick your thumb. But imagine a few dozen of these being shoved into your scalp. And there's even people now today suggesting that the crown of thorns would not have been the wreath that we typically picture. They're actually now suggesting it would have been more like a helmet that would have just come down over your entire head. And that we've kind of gotten that detail wrong. But hey, we're not done yet. We're not done yet. Verse 3. Verse 3, they're going to put a purple robe on him. Why? Because purple is the color of royalty. And Jesus is a king, isn't he? So let's put a robe on him that's purple, and let's mock him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then we'll just start beating him some more. That's what they're doing in verse 3. Only for Pilate to come out in verse 4 and parade him in front of everybody and say, "Look what I did for you. Are you satisfied now? I did this for you." And then out comes Jesus. But are they satisfied? Nah, they knew what they wanted before they even picked him up off the garden, out of the garden. They knew what they wanted. They're like, "No, crucify, crucify." Does he deserve any of this? Absolutely not. Objection, Your Honor. Badgering the witness, for the love of God. Badgering the witness. What does the judge say, please? Oh, goodness gracious. All right. Well, I should have gone to law school, I guess. I don't know what else to do. We're not doing so great. All right, let's read on. I guess let's see let's get to the verdict. Verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. Oh, come on. What? From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." Wait, when did the Jews start loving the Romans? Oh my goodness. All right. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. Oh, interesting. The day of preparation for the Passover. The day you would get the lamb ready to be sacrificed for the sins of the people. That's curious. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold, your king!" They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to him, "Shall I crucify your king?" And in the greatest, most ridiculous thing ever said in the history of man, the chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. All right. Well, can we get a verdict? We the people, in the case of Rome versus Jesus from Nazareth, find the defendant guilty. Well, we tried. We tried, didn't we? Personally, I think all of our objections were more than valid. Don't you? I thought they were, but it's almost like this trial was rigged. It's almost like the outcome was predetermined. But, here's the thing. The trial wasn't just rigged by the Jews. And it wasn't just rigged by the Romans. It was also rigged by us. It was rigged by us too. Because, make no mistake, Jesus was innocent of all charges. I should be very clear about it. Jesus was innocent of all charges, but here's the thing. In a larger sense, ultimately, he wasn't really on trial for his sins because he had none. He was on trial for our sins. That's the thing, and that's why there was no defense that could save him. He was on trial for our sins. He was on trial for all the wrong that we've done, and he was on trial ultimately for all the ways that we have fallen short, the ways that we have messed it up. Every curse word that you have ever uttered out of your lips, every single individual angry outburst where you lashed out at somebody, every fit of pride, every time you have selfishly put your own needs in front of someone else's, every word that has ever come out of your mouth that was gossip or slander or a lie, some sort of twisting of the truth, some sort of deception, every person you've ever hit, every time you've disrespected your parents, every premarital sexual encounter you've ever had, every drunken episode, every time you've hypocritically judged somebody else, every time you've chased your own desires without first consulting the Lord or considering his perspective. Every time you've ever done something that put a stumbling block in front of another believer, anytime you have done these and any of 100,000 other things I could name if I was going to stand here and just run through the list. Every single one of those crimes put him on that cross. Not just collectively, but individually. It's almost like he was on trial for each. He was on trial like millions and millions and millions of times for each and every individual one of those sins. Every single one. He was on trial for our sins and for our crimes, as Isaiah told us he would be. In Isaiah 53, verse 6, that says, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So the fact is, we sinned. We messed up. We broke God's holy law. And Jesus stepped forward to pay for it. Jesus paid the price that we should have paid. That should have been us on trial that day. That should have been us in front of the floggers. That should have been us being paraded out in front of everybody. And so, like, at our Easter study this past Wednesday, I asked the question, I said, Jesus was willing to trade places with you and take your punishment. And I asked the very forthright question, but would you be willing to trade places with him? Would you be willing to trade places back with him? It's a tough question. Because you know what the right answer should be, but you don't want to answer too fast. Remember Peter? I will lay down my life for you. Never mind. Right? So we don't want to answer that question too fast. Spoiler alert. I don't actually have some great big life application for you to send you home with today. I just, I don't. Other than to say that if you are a Christ follower, if you have made that commitment, that sacrifice, you better go home, and I'll do this too, and you better thank the Lord of the universe and creator and sustainer of all things, and thank him multiple times a day even, that he was willing to swap places with you, because you and I both know we would not want to swap places back with him. We better go home and we better thank him till we cannot speak anymore, till our lungs are empty and our voices are hoarse. We should thank him that he was willing to pay that price for us, that he was willing to endure all that, ironically, so that we wouldn't end up in a place even worse than a cross. Because we could go into how bad hell would be. But he saved us from things way worse than a flogging and a crown of thorns and a cross. He saved us from all of that. But listen, we're not even done yet. I don't mean today. We are done for today. But we're not really done yet. Listen, if you log out now, or if you don't come back next week, sorry, I know you have to go back to Ruston, or if you don't come back next week, or if or the next 2 weeks even, you've only really heard a third of the story. Because here's the thing. Yes, Jesus took all of these sins and he went on trial with them. Yes, he took every sin you and I have committed and he brought them and he went on trial with them. But next week, when we get to the crucifixion story, he's going to take all those sins with him and he's going to drag them up on that cross with him. And those sins are going to get nailed to the cross with him. And when he dies, those sins are going to die with him. And then the week after that, when we get to Easter Sunday, and Jesus takes that first breath of new life and gets up, and Jesus rises from that tomb, those sins don't rise with him. They stay dead and buried. So you've got about a third of the story so far. Please join us as we continue walking through the most amazing events that have ever happened in history.